What's up? What's up, everyone? Kevin Allen here from DFS Army, and this is our NFL DFS Week 1 Weekend Review. All right, guys, what's up? Welcome back to the Weekend Review, and this is a really, really important thing that we do every single week of the NFL DFS season. We look back on the week. Particularly, I'm going to go over my cash lineup. We're going to do a cash lineup review. We're going to compare that to the tools we had at our disposal, compare the lineup to the tools. Let's see if we could have landed in the right spot. Let's also get an overview of what happened this week and learn from our positives, learn from our negatives, and move on and hopefully be better than, and hopefully do better or continue to improve every single week. That's what we have to do. Travis, man, it almost helped me recover. Last night I was in first place in that showdown, about to recover awesomely from a massive week until that touchdown to Robert Woods compelled Stafford into the nuts. But we nailed the showdown breakdown like never before. We said, 5-1 onslaught stacks with the Rams. That is what won. So really nailed it. And hopefully a lot of guys, I did not see the wacky tweet, so you'll have to let me know what that is. But let's get into it, guys. Let's talk about, first I'm going to start with my cash lineup. So that's what you see on screen here, all right? It was not good, okay? It was hashtag not a good lineup. And it did not do well. And, of course, lost everything in this lineup. And I want to talk about what went on here, why the lineup is what it is, what we could have done the same, what we could have done different, what was the chalk, and what won. So the first thing to recognize for week 1 is a lot of people were off. A lot of chalk was bad chalk, right? So just to acknowledge it, here's the cash line for this contest. It was on DraftKings a 124 points. That's what you needed to cash, okay? And that's what you needed. That's what you needed to cash in this contest. You needed, in cash games, 124. What that means, that was a very, very low cash, okay? It's not shocking to me that the low cash is what was required because there were a lot of landmines in week 1, and that happens every year. There's a lot of speculation going into the first week of the season. A lot of things we just don't know. Like, we speculate, but we have no idea really what's going to happen in a lot of these spots. We have no idea how people are going to get used. And so this is what happens. You can have a rough week 1, especially those of us who rely heavily on, less on just kind of on like statistical projections for players rather than just, kind of slapping things together. So let's take a look at what happened with my lineup first. And then we're going, there it is. Mostert, that happened for me as well. So my approach this week was, I was like, I liked a lot of the lower cost running backs that were in great spots. So my approach was, let me play 2 of the middling running backs and 1 stud, and then fill it out with, a couple cheap wide receivers and an expensive one. That was my approach. So the first thing for me was, I really like Jalen Hurts as my cash game quarterback. I said it in my notes that if you take a look at my notes for the week, I talked about Jalen Hurts. I like Hurts, productive. He's a high floor player that should produce at least 50 yards, tricky to stack in GPP, et cetera, et cetera. Although he was great in stacks. And I just write in here that he makes for a very good cash play this week. And this is who I used, right? I also thought that both Josh Allen and Kyler Murray were really reasonable cash plays. They're the 3 players I marked as all on my sheet this week. Obviously, Kyler Murray was a smash as well, and that was a great play. Josh Allen, not as great. Scored less. So Josh Allen would have hurt your lineup a little bit. Kyler Murray, great, but I played Hurts, wanted to save the salary. Perfectly fine move, right? Let me go back to my lineup here. Oh, I'm on the wrong one. Let me go back to my lineup here so we can go along with it. Now, originally, and of course, So one of the ways that I pick my players for cash games is I just use the DFS Army chalkboard. It makes it very simple because we have elite ownership projections. It's going to show you really who to play. And if you actually take a look at the chalkboard here, it was pretty on point, except for one thing. Like Raheem Mostert, Christian McCaffrey, CM Sizzles, and Alvin Kamara were the three choices that that our ownership projection said these are your chalk plays. These are the guys you should use. Joe Mixon, Antonio Gibson in the mix as well. So I'm hanging around this group here, but I went with Mostert and Gibson and McCaffrey. So what ends up happening? Everybody's saying Mostert's a bum. Mostert gets hurt on the first drive of the game. Comes out with just 2 fantasy points. The running game for 49ers, generic 49ers running game, absolutely crushed. But unfortunately, Mostert comes out, knocks out only 25% of the field because he was a late swap. So we didn't even get the protection of massively high ownership on Mostert. As far as Gibson went, he was on his way to a pretty good game. It could have gone either way between Gibson and Mixon here. And in hindsight, probably the correct choice would have been Mixon. I liked Gibson because his team wasn't an underdog. Of course, they lost. I liked Mixon less because his team was an underdog, but of course, he won. Yeah, Mostert was kicking ass. Mostert was going to smash that game. It was the right move, but he just got hurt. Shit happens. That I don't regret putting in Mostert. It didn't work, but I don't regret it. Christian McCaffrey, borderline always somebody you want to play. Christian McCaffrey was just inches away from an even bigger day, 98 yards rushing, 89 yards receiving. Didn't even get a touchdown and got you 27 fantasy points. It just shows the upside. Christian McCaffrey at 9,500 was a steal. He was an easy play, 50% owned in this contest. Should have been 100% owned. So another chalk play was Kyle Pitts. He did fine, 7-10, 65% owned, not hurting you. Here's the killer chalk as well. Second piece of killer chalk. So you can only afford so many mistakes. Why weren't most people on that Denver game? I don't know. All right. So with more, you know what? We speculated with some rookies week 1. Some of those speculations worked out amazing, and some of them didn't. Moore, for some reason, every time Zach Wilson threw his way, it looked like he was like throwing it into the ground. He was falling down when he threw it. There was one big play to Moore that almost resulted in a monster play, but ended up getting broken up. So there were lots of opportunities for Moore at 3K. In the end of the day, like Devonta Smith, Chase Smith, Waddle, a lot of the rookies did really well. One other choice that we could have had in at wide receiver was Marvin Jones Jr. See, look, I mean, if you take a look at who the chalkboard recommended, I kind of didn't want to play Marquez Callaway. I just always thought he was kind of overrated play, right? But the chalkboard then recommends Ridley and Adams at pay up. By the way, both of these were a disaster. So these chalk pieces were a disaster. But notice the other thing. Not a lot of high owned, really there just wasn't a consensus supreme value out of any of these guys. There was not a consensus. If you take a look at the ownership projection outside of Callaway and Moore, who was a consensus play and wound up 45% owned. So, again, not a killer. When you have a guy who's 45% owned, the whole field played him. It didn't work out. But Marvin Jones Jr. was another guy that we could have found on the chalkboard. He was hanging out right up there, and he did have a really good game based on his. So he was the other cheapie. If you didn't go Callaway Moore, it was Marvin Jones Jr. And Marvin Jones put up, I think, 18 fantasy points. So he ended up smashing his projection. Again, a lot of misses here. T. Higgins was the guy I went with. Okay, so just going back, and again, I'm using the chalkboard. I'm looking at potential volume. We got T. Higgins in there. T. Higgins was smashing in this game as well, comes out with an injury. So, he's doing great, winds up coming out. I thought we could have gotten even more than 15 points out of him and maybe had a good shot. Falcons defense, I just paid down for the cheapest one. Didn't work out. Actually, if you note on this slate, let me just say again, Falcons 40% on. So we ate a lot of chalk and cash, which is what you want to do. Let's see what the top guy did. All right, so the top guy is just making dumb lineups. And of course it works. Like, this lineup is ridiculous, but you don't want to be this guy either, by the way. So just to be clear, where you want to be, you don't want to be this guy putting in Carson Wentz, Kareem Hunt at 1% owned, 0.3% quarterback, 1% everywhere. This is a person who should never play in cash, but yet he won. That's why process over results is really important. This guy over time will lose all the time in cash games. But you kind of wanted to be hanging around in this zone, right? So let's see what some of these other guys who did just fine. There's Marquez Callaway, Supreme Chalk. Again, we said, let's get off of this chalk. It doesn't look like good chalk. I talked about it all week. That was a good call. But this guy ate Marvin Jones Jr., and the rest of the lineup is pretty well just, load up on a couple of stud running backs, get the good quarterback. Didn't really take much. Look how little it took to cash in cash games today. Yes, you're right. That was a tournament lineup the guy just threw in a cash game. That's fine. Some people do that. But overall, look at what it took this week. You just ate a bunch of chalk. Marvin Jones Jr., 44%. This was the chalk piece that I missed. But if you throw like T. Higgins in here instead and just a standard lineup, boom, you're done. You're good. So for me, hopefully a lot of you guys did cash your cash games. We were all over Hurts. We were all over a lot of these right plays. I like T. Higgins over Pittman, for example. Elijah Moore was a disaster, but you could win with that one disaster in your lineup. Everybody played Pitts. That was a fine play. He was cheap. As a matter of fact, Pitts got thrown to a lot. If you caught a few more, it would have been even better. But these guys didn't hurt your lineup. And, hindsight, the best piece of hindsight advice, it's really tough because Mixon and Gibson wound up with the same ownership projection. So nothing like really clearly delineated these two. Like if you went with Mixon over Gibson, you probably cashed. And it was that simple of a difference. All three of the running backs did just fine. And Mostert obviously was a chalk disaster. So just a little look back. I think going forward, I'm really not sure the lesson. I think the big lesson is, listen, week one is weird in a lot of ways. We have a lot more information to go off of. Projection models will improve every single week. Now we have snap data. Now we have target shares. Now we know some things that obviously we're just speculating about before week one. So we'll be able to get to that point next week or two or three where we're really able to predict opportunity. Opportunity is king. Opportunity is everything. High floor. We want players with tons of opportunities. Like another thing that we didn't know, I'll just go back to the lineup here. One thing that I did that didn't work, obviously, was I paid down one of the running back spots in order to afford Davante Adams. Adams had an epically bad game for him. Aaron Rodgers looked like absolute shit. Packers benched in the third quarter, like complete blowout. Jameis Winston, just a really, really unexpected result. Yeah, you didn't do wrong. But the path to cashing was right there. Like, it's not like we were so far. If you just, the only difference was making the decision to play the high-end wide receiver. So if you just went, you know what, fuck that. I'm doing 2 stud running backs, throwing Kamara in there or Dalvin Cook. Either one, and you go pay down at Davante Adams down to some 8K, a 6K wide receiver, let's say like a Deontay Johnson or something like that, then it all works out just fine. So normally, we do want to favor kind of locked in points running backs in our cash games. And, let's just keep that in mind going forward. The other thing is, remember, favored running backs are better than running backs who aren't favored. That's just little details for our cash game stuff. I'm going to take a look at the tournament winner last week just to show what it took to take down the tournament. I did not have a great showing in GPP at all yesterday, again, because I went very heavy on Raheem Mostert and just got walloped. I was on a lot of the right stacks, of course, in the sheet. I loved Kyler Murray. Kyler Murray was great. Kyler Murray +2 was great. Although the problem with the Kyler Murray stack was the comeback didn't help. All right, this is a great question. Did you consider making late swaps in the cash lineup? I had some with Adams and Callaway, swapped to Landry and Hardman. Ended up a little better. This is a great little point, Todd, and I'm glad you mentioned it. If you are in your cash games, and I didn't think of it, I was just busy making afternoon tournament lineups yesterday. But if your cash games, what you're doing is you're using a lot of chalky pieces, and everybody else is. So if after the morning slate, you're finding that, I got I got the Mostert bomb in my lineup. That was enough to know. You already knew, like, oh shit, though he's only 25% owned. I've got this too. If he was 70% owned, I'd be like, no big deal. Like Elijah Moore, 50, 60%. Marquez Callaway, kind of similar, where you're like, oh, those duds, they're not going to really hurt you. But the 25% Mostert was a killer. So, yes, what you should absolutely look to do, but only in that circumstance where you played only in that circumstance where you played a non-chalky piece that got destroyed in your cash lineup, you should then look to late swap onto some. So yeah, I mean, you had Adams and Callaway, who were the chalkiest pieces. I mean, Landry and Hardman is not a great dollar for dollar swap either. It looks like you couldn't spend all the money. Part of that might have been you should have been able to get like a Kamara in there for Adams. So the one thing is here, if you look at my lineup, no, back to the cash game. If you look at my lineup, Christian McCaffrey, who was an early game guy, I just had him in the flex. I didn't really think it through, but it's a reminder to make sure you put the players from the latest game in the flex so that you have that flexibility to make those changes. So something to think about going forward. I definitely overlooked it in my personal lineup here as well. Just make sure, like in this lineup, it should have been, actually, I think all three of my running backs were early, so I wasn't able to do it. But if you're able to do it, you want to get the late game player in the flex. Like I see what happened here. I was not able to do it because all my guys went off in the early slate, so I wasn't able to get like a Devontae Adams in the late. But he should have been there. And if I was failing and I had an Adams in there, Adams wasn't that high owned, so I don't know if I would have made that swap. But like a Marquez Callaway, for example, that would have been the perfect guy to switch off of because we knew he was going to be supreme chalk. And so you just switch off of him. Could have taken like Deontay Harris. I think that one of these wide receivers from the Saints that ended up going off. So you definitely want to do that in cash games. It is absolutely the right move. I don't know about as a rule, I want to force it, but in general, it is helpful if you have a couple of afternoon guys for exactly what the reason Todd just said. You do want to swap in lesser owned players. If you already know you're losing with Marquez Callaway in the flex, you absolutely want to get off of that guy. Like there's no doubt that is a money-making move over time. So you definitely want to swap off of that. Now, I just want to look at the tournament winning score here. What won the million? And I want to show you guys what won the million. It was a score of 224, a lower than average Millie Maker winner score. But look at this crazy ass lineup. So this is what it would have taken. There's some craziness in here and some chalk. But first thing to note is the total ownership here: 3, 4, 7, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90%. So under 100% total ownership on this tournament winning lineup. Okay. You've got a couple of players that were super chalk. I mean, we talked about just load up on Kelsey, accept the points there. T. Higgins was a guy I was playing. I liked him a lot. Cardinals defense, no one played them. This was probably a big part of why he won. And I'm looking at a couple of these guys that kind of finished well. One thing they all have in common, Saints, they played the Chief defenses, but they played pretty good ones. And that was a massive. Notice all the top lineups, what ended up happening. Like playing a good cheap defense is a great way. Like this guy, Shredder and Cutter, I mean, one swap to one of these other ones, Bengals, and he's winning $1 million instead of 10K. So playing the right defense is really interesting. Let's look at some of the names of players who wound up in perfect lineups. Again, Melvin Gordon, who the fuck was thinking about playing him? 4% owned, but there he is showing up in a tournament winner. Melvin Gordon's in quite a few of these lineups, not all, but a few. Hawkinson was a real overlook on this week. He was very much in play. Some of these players I can't get behind. I don't think they were in play, but some were, right? Gordon, 70-yard touchdown run. Like right now, sell him in your season long. He's not going to win you leagues, but Gordon, that's what happens. You can catch lightning in a bottle. But the big thing here, all right, so let's just take a look at the makeup of some of these lineups. So we've got a Joe Burrow lineup stacked with just, looks like his running back, Mixon, Joe Burrow, Joe Mixon, T. Higgins. So 3 players from Cincinnati. No comeback on Minnesota at all. So this is just I don't even know if this was done on purpose or this was handcrafted, to be honest. There's not really much correlation. The correlation is Burrow to T. Higgins, fine. I don't even think that's what helped him win. They didn't even smash. Joe Mixon, Melvin Gordon, low ownership. Tyreek Hill at low ownership, of course. So he's got Hill and Kelsey in the same lineup together. Fine by me. Always love those two. Could not afford Pat Mahomes. So we went with Joe Burrow. Just a pay down option. Interesting. Chalk, Marvin Jones Jr., a little less owned than I would have expected, but he was one of the chalk plays that we all liked going into the thing. So really interesting. Deebo Samuel, who nobody thought to play, 5% owned. Late news comes out that Brandon Ayuk not starting. This other guy, Trent Sherfield, is in there. San Francisco ends up having like an offensive juggernaut game. Deebo Samuel smashes at very low ownership. And of course, Tyreek Hill, who we know is a stud, but was overshadowed by a lot of other studs, including Calvin Ridley and his dud, or Stephon Diggs and his dud, or Devontae Adams and his dud, or Jefferson and his dud, or A.J. Brown and his fucking dud, or Julio Jones and his dud. So a lot of players dudded today. So what we learned week 1, tricky week across the board. The chalk did not hit. The scores overall were low. It's funny. As part of DFS Army, one of the things you know is like the chalky weeks, everybody's happy. They put up big scores even when they lose. But these rough weeks where a lot of the chalk just didn't work and a lot of the plays that look good on paper didn't work, everybody's like, oh, it's fucking so. I had a shitty score. Everybody had a shitty score. Again, we saw last year that tournament winners for DraftKings normally hit 260, 265, and here you're winning $1 million at a 222. So, hindsight was week 1, a lot of unknowns. Stay off the chalk. Less chalky lines. Let's take a look at some of the top 10s here. Mahomes, again, Mahomes to Hill, one off stack. Hawkinson, a really smart play. Like I said, you know what? Jared Goff loves throwing to the tight end. He's produced really good outcomes to tight ends. We all think Detroit sucks balls, and they kind of do. But at the same time, they're more competent than maybe, they don't have good wide receivers, so they're probably going to throw to the tight end a lot is really what it comes down to. And they threw a lot to the running backs, which showed. How to use the ceiling projections. The only way you use the ceiling projection, number one, ceiling projections are loaded into correlative stacks. Got to be careful. You always got to be very careful with ceiling projections. I like them much more as a visual tool than something you want to optimize by, because the ceiling, even for a 3K garbage player that doesn't play, might be 15 points, because if they do come in the game and they do have a good game, they'll have a ceiling that will force like these cheap 3 and 4K guys all up in your lineups. So what I use the ceiling for is in judging between two players in a tournament, I like to look at the ceilings. Let's see if we got our back test going. I like to look at player ceiling. Here we go. Let's take a look at the back test. First of all, I like to look at the ceiling and say, all right, if I'm comparing between two players of the same price, like let's look at Christian McCaffrey and Dalvin Cook. They were similarly priced, but wow, Christian McCaffrey's got a higher floor and ceiling. So that for me just tells me, Christian McCaffrey's probably the better play here. Or you could look down here at Alvin Kamara and say, oh, wow, Alvin Kamara floor and ceiling is kind of like, or mean projection and ceiling a little higher than Dalvin Cook. So, looking at this in tournaments kind of might have shifted you to like a Kamara McCaffrey if you just kind of compare the upside in tournaments. That's really what it's there for. I don't recommend doing actual optimizing based on ceilings. Let's take one quick look at what the nuts lineup could have been. One thing I want you guys to do, you can optimize by final fantasy points, and you could see, all right, the perfect score. Look at this. If you were absolutely perfect yesterday, you scored a 261. No one even came close. But the perfect lineup had Jared Goff. Wouldn't have thought of that. Jamal Williams, who winds up having this big game out of nowhere. Joe Mixon, okay, we're on him. I don't think Sterling Shepard was that shocking, but he is a little shocking. Adam Thielen went bananas in that game, of course, when everybody's going to play Justin Jefferson. That's how it goes. Debo Samuel with the big game, Hawkinson, Hill, and Cardinal. So this was the quote unquote nuts lineup. No one even came close. The closest one. It's important to note in NFL DFS that no one ever hits the perfect lineup. So that's why we can really focus correlation so well, because no one's hitting the perfect lineup. There might not be much correlation in this lineup. There is Goff to Hawkinson. Actually, there was correlation because you had a Goff, Hawkinson, Debo Samuel stack. But look at the ownership on this thing. 46%, 62, 53. So like if we made a whole bunch of these lineups, I just want to see also how much salary they spent, but we made a whole bunch of these lineups. They're extremely low owned, first of all. Looking back, I think QB +2 is generally going to be the best way. The comeback, I think week 1, what happens is you get some teams that are just discombobulated and offensively not clicking. You saw that with just a bunch of teams like Tennessee. They were just off because it's week 1. They haven't had a lot of practice. That happens. You never know where it's going to come. You saw like Rodgers and crew. They were really off. How often does it? That's less common. It does happen, but the running back is generally not correlated with the QB. So one of the things I tend to do is, like, even if you don't disallow the rule, unless it's like a Derrick Henry, it does happen enough that they smash on the same team together, but it's, let's say, not correlated. I've not found much positive correlation between a QB and his running back. And we're trying to create as much positive correlation in the lineup for mathematical purposes. They can be easy money, I guess. Wasn't easy money for me this week, but sure. I never think cash games are easy money. Cash games are not easy money because notice the whole field, by the way, outside of a couple of boneheads in your cash game here, outside of a couple of boneheads, most of the field is basically eating chalk and just making similar lineups. I always say this, it's too big. Look what won. Moore in the lineup, Derrick Henry, a pay up dud in the lineup. You could win your cash games because everybody's kind of eating a lot of the chalk. Kamara, McCaffrey, Callaway, chalk, Marvin Jones Jr., Moore. This was the 3 cheap guy approach. The only difference was, I wonder if he didn't have, he went with Fant instead of Pitts. I don't know why, right? That was enough. If you look at what won, it was not that hard. And a lot of these lineups have a shitload of duds in them. Look at all the duds in the winning lineups, guys. Look at all these duds. 61%, 45%. I have the cash line at here, 124. So you might be talking about FanDuel or something. On DraftKings, it was about 124.86. Yeah. So anyway, I just want to look at, again, back to the tournament winners. I just want to show you something on the Dom station just for interesting evidentiary purposes, right? The ownerships for all of these sort of nuts level lineups, 45%, 60, 47, 50, 52. What this tells me when all the nuts, 44. So these are the best possible lineups you could have produced, 50%, 62. Now, normally the ownerships on winning lineups will float closer to 80 to 90%. So really what's going on is week 1 was tough. The chalk did not hit for the most part. And when that happens, you get like really super contrarian lineups were what required to take down tournaments on this particular week. Pat Mahomes in there. Here's your Pat Mahomes. But is this, yeah, so you got Holmes to Reek, Hill, Hawkinson, 49.6, 49.7. One thing I'm noticing is at very least, and this is nice, most of these lineups are spending a lot of the salary cap. Like this one is a 49.9. This is a legitimate lineup that you might have fallen onto, if you were doing the right thing. Again, a lot of Mahomes to Tyreek Hill in this grouping. Yeah, some lineups that you really would have fallen on. Anyway, I'm going to wrap it up there, guys. Week in review. I'm trying to see if there's any other tools I wanted to look at. Not really. Let me try something here. I wonder what would have happened. Let me just see. Yeah, so the projections were forcing Marvin Jones Jr. in, Elijah Moore, of course, Raheem Mostert, Calvin Ridley was a dud. Travis Kelce, I think, was good. And then, of course, the turd that was Marquez Callaway. So get a look at, yeah, it would have taken lineup number 4. And yeah, lineup number 4 here, this Mahomes. You need the mix-in version of it with Corey Davis. So if you look at lineup number 4, that was certainly good enough to win cash games, but that ain't good enough overall. So really interesting for tonight. We will have a showdown breakdown today at 4 p.m. We crushed the showdown last night. I couldn't have called it better. Bobby Wow's Van Jefferson call was crazy. I told you guys to play 5-1 Ram stacks onslaught, and that was what won the tournament. Like I said, I was in first place up until the last fucking touchdown. I was really hoping to make up for my week on Sunday, but maybe we can make it up on Monday night. We got a good one tonight. Lamar Jackson, load up on him. So we're breaking that down today at 4 p.m. We'll be back next week and every week for full transparency and our weeks in review. See you later, guys.